My stepmom lied about everything: her husband's death, her past, and her love for my dad. Until I found the man she buried alive. I'm a 32-year-old woman, and honestly, I'm at a loss for words right now. That's why I'm turning to the Reddit community, because I could really use some outside perspective. I grew up with a lot of privileges. My family was well off, and my parents always made sure I had everything I ever asked for. They were college sweethearts, madly in love, and their marriage was strong and full of warmth. But when I was 8, everything changed. My parents were in a horrible car crash. I still remember the moment we got the call. I was with my grandparents at the time, and we all rushed to the hospital in a panic. Standing outside the operating room while they were in surgery was one of the scariest, most traumatizing experiences of my life. None of us knew if they were going to make it. Tragically, my mom didn't survive the accident. Somehow, my dad pulled through, but the guilt of being the one who lived while she didn't hung over him like a cloud. He struggled deeply after that, especially when it came to parenting. And honestly, I was barely holding it together myself while mourning the loss of my mom. That's when my aunt, my dad's sister, stepped in. She was incredibly close to him and didn't hesitate to help. She got us both into therapy to try and work through our grief, which was a lifesaver. Around the same time, my dad started going to grief support groups to meet others who had experienced similar losses. It was there that he met a woman named Linda. Linda eventually became my stepmom, but it started with friendship. My dad and Linda connected pretty quickly, and after a while, she was introduced to me. As time went on, their bond grew, and before we knew it, they were dating. 3 years later, they got married, even though a lot of people felt it was too soon. But they've been together ever since. From the very beginning, my aunt had her doubts about Linda. She voiced her concerns, but my dad felt strongly that Linda was the right person for him, and he believed their connection was genuine. Before they tied the knot, my dad made something very clear to Linda: he would be the only one responsible for parenting me. Any discipline or decisions regarding me would come from him, not her. He didn't want her to step into the mom role, just to be a supportive and responsible adult in my life. And to be fair, she's mostly honored that boundary. She hasn't tried to interfere much. Linda shared early on that she had been married before. Her first husband, Mark, died in a building fire years ago. She used to talk about how tough those days were, constantly struggling to make ends meet. She painted a picture of a life filled with hardship and financial strain, and we all felt for her. Losing someone you love hits hard, we understood that. But after she met my dad, everything changed for her. She went from barely scraping by to living comfortably in luxury. And she definitely leaned into that lifestyle. Linda loves expensive handbags and designer shoes, and it doesn't matter what the occasion is, she'll dress to impress. She thrives on attention and being in the spotlight. Over the years, our relationship stayed civil. In the beginning, she tried the whole let's be close routine, but I wasn't interested and made that clear pretty quickly. I give her respect because she's my dad's wife, but that's really where our connection begins and ends. I never had a reason to be suspicious of her, but I always kept a bit of emotional distance. Now, fast forward to the present. I just graduated from college and landed a job with this really cool tech company. The catch? It's all the way across the country. My dad was hoping I'd come work for his business, but I felt strongly about carving out my own path. I wanted to start from the bottom, learn the ropes, and build something on my own in the tech world. Before I left, Linda threw a little farewell get-together with some family and friends. It was sweet, and you could tell people were genuinely going to miss me. There were a few emotional goodbyes, especially with the big move coming up. The day of my flight was a blur. I was full of mixed emotions, nervous but excited to be starting fresh in a new city, completely on my own for the first time. My first day at the new job was overwhelming in the best way. It's a massive office, mostly filled with brilliant engineers and tech minds who work around the clock. Late nights are kind of the norm there. About a week ago, while I was having lunch in the company cafeteria, I noticed a guy chatting with my boss. Something about him felt familiar, though I couldn't quite figure out why. His face triggered something in my memory, but I couldn't place it. I figured maybe he was someone I'd seen back home. Before I could dwell on it too long, a coworker reminded me I needed to prep for a presentation for a new client. I quickly wrapped up my lunch and headed to the conference room. When I walked in, that same man from lunch was sitting next to my boss. Turns out, he was the potential client we were about to pitch to. I was still trying to figure out where I knew him from, so I wasn't paying much attention when my boss said his name. I just focused on setting up the projector and diving into my slides. Throughout the whole presentation, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen him before. It was like something in my brain was trying to piece together a puzzle. After the meeting, the guy seemed impressed. He and my boss stayed back to talk more about the project while I slipped out with a smile, proud that things went well. A little while later, I spotted him walking toward the elevator. That nagging feeling was still eating at me, so I followed, hoping to figure it out. We ended up in the same elevator, and he gave me a polite smile. I didn't want to come off as weird or anything, so I casually told him that he looked really familiar. He gave me a curious look, so I asked if he happened to be from my hometown. He said no and asked for my name. When I told him, he said he didn't recognize it and didn't know anyone by that last name. So I let it go, shook his hand, and thanked him again for bringing his business to our firm. Later during a team meeting, my boss officially introduced him to us. His name was Mark. Apparently, he's a self-made tech entrepreneur who created an app aimed at revolutionizing how we handle recyclable waste. That's when my stomach dropped. The name Mark hit me like a brick. Suddenly, I remembered why he looked so familiar. Back when I was a kid, my dad and Linda had gone out one evening, and being the curious little snoop I was, I started digging around the house. I ended up finding a photo album hidden deep in one of Linda's drawers. Most of it was just old pictures of her, nothing too interesting until I turned a page and saw a photo of Linda standing next to a man. In the photo, they were both smiling at the camera, bundled up in winter coats and standing in front of a Christmas tree. The festive scene gave it this cozy, cheerful feel. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I never asked Linda who the man was, but I assumed he was someone from her past, maybe an old friend or relative. Just a little glimpse into her life before us, nothing major. But I had no idea that one simple snapshot would circle back into my life like this, stirring up a storm of questions and revelations I never saw coming. Once I started connecting the dots between the man I just met at work and Linda's so-called deceased husband, my brain went into overdrive. I kept wondering, how could Mark still be alive if Linda had told us he died years ago? It completely threw me off. I didn't know what to think, and the idea of confronting Linda felt impossible. If she'd been lying about something that big for all these years, I doubted she'd suddenly own up to it. I needed actual proof before I made any moves, something solid to confirm that the man sitting in our conference room was indeed the same Mark from her past. Ever since that realization, I've been hanging close during meetings with Mark, trying to find a chance to talk to him one-on-one. And today, with my boss out on medical leave, I figured this might be my window. After we wrapped up our meeting, I asked Mark if he'd like to grab lunch with me at the office cafeteria. He agreed, and we headed down together. At first, we just talked about work stuff, projects, apps, the usual. Then the conversation started drifting toward our personal lives. I mentioned that I'd lost my mom when I was a kid, and Mark looked genuinely moved. There was this softness in his eyes, like he truly understood what that kind of loss felt like. That's when I brought up my dad. I told Mark that my father was married to a woman named Linda. As soon as I said her name, everything about his expression changed. He went quiet and looked at me with this almost startled look, like he was trying to process what I had just said. You could practically see the wheels turning in his head. I asked if he knew her, and after a pause, he gave a slow nod. Then he asked if I could show him a picture. I pulled up a photo of Linda on my phone, and the moment he saw it, he gasped. That reaction told me everything I needed to know. I started filling in some details, Linda's version of the past. The fire, the poverty, the tragic story of her late husband. As I talked, Mark's expression darkened. His eyebrows pulled tighter together, and he looked almost stunned by what I was saying, like none of it made any sense to him. Then Mark shared his side of the story. He told me he had been married to a woman named Sarah, and that their time together had been filled with love, 2 beautiful years. Tragically, Sarah died in a skiing accident while they were on vacation. That loss broke him. At a friend's suggestion, he joined a local grief support group, hoping it might help him begin to heal. That's where he met Linda. She told him she was grieving the death of her husband too, claiming he'd been killed in a shooting near their home. They bonded through their pain. The group gave both of them a little comfort, proof that they weren't alone in their grief. Over time, Mark and Linda became close, and eventually they got married. Mark said he thought it might be his second chance at love. At first, things went smoothly. But then, a conversation about his will brought out the first signs of trouble. Mark had explained that if anything happened to him, his house would go to his brother's kids. It was a family home, and he wanted to keep it that way. He reassured Linda that she'd be financially taken care of with his savings, but she didn't take it well. She questioned him about the house, about the life insurance, about everything. When he told her that his brother was the named beneficiary on his policy, things exploded. She was furious. She believed she deserved the house and the money. That argument spiraled into a huge fight, and from then on, things just kept getting worse. Linda started picking fights over the tiniest things. She even began accusing him of cheating, with no proof, just wild claims. The constant tension wore them both down, and eventually they realized they couldn't go on like that. They agreed to divorce, figuring it was the healthiest option for both of them. But during the divorce proceedings, Mark said Linda completely flipped the script. She accused him of financially abusing her, saying he'd used money to control her. She was younger than him, and Mark believes she used that to her advantage, painting herself as the vulnerable one. Her lies stuck, and they did serious damage to his reputation. Friends turned cold. Family started pulling away. Mark's lawyer urged him to settle, and to avoid more damage to his name, he agreed to pay a large alimony just to end it all and protect what was left of his dignity. Since the divorce, Mark hadn't heard a single word about Linda until today. When I told him about my dad, it was the first time he'd gotten any news of her in years. Hearing his story left me completely stunned. Everything he said painted Linda in a completely different light. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, this was a carefully crafted lie. She had faked an entire tragedy, claiming Mark died in a fire that never even happened. It was like something out of a movie, except it was real and it had worked. She used that story to join another grief support group and found her next target, my father. The more I thought about it, the more horrified I became. My dad, kind and trusting as he is, had been drawn into her web, falling for the image she created of a grieving widow who had survived so much pain. It was all a lie. After lunch, I promised Mark I'd do everything I could to get to the bottom of it. I've spent the entire day just sitting with this information, trying to process it and figure out what comes next. And now, as I'm writing this, I still can't shake the shock or the anger. I keep thinking about how seamlessly she wove her way into our lives, hiding all of this behind a smile. It's hard to wrap my head around the fact that all of this, Linda's lies, the fake tragedy, the grief group manipulation, was likely done just to benefit from my father's money. On one hand, he really does seem happy with her, and that makes things complicated. I don't want to hurt him by throwing all of this in his face. But on the other hand, I can't ignore the truth. I now know that Linda has a pattern joining grief support groups just to target vulnerable people, people who are mourning, and using their pain to her advantage. The moment I realized she faked her husband's death in a fire just to gain our sympathy, something in me shifted. That kind of lie goes beyond personal, it's calculated. And I found myself torn about what to do next. Would I be making things worse by telling my dad the truth? Or would I be protecting him from someone who's been deceiving him all along? Update 1. After thinking it over, I took the advice I'd seen from others and decided to open up to someone I trusted, my Aunt Hilda. I needed another adult to hear me out and believe me before I could even think about confronting my dad. Since I couldn't take time off work, I just started my new job. I asked Aunt Hilda if she'd be willing to fly out and visit me. She arrived last night, smiling ear to ear when we reunited. I had planned everything out, a quiet breakfast with her and Mark, hoping she could hear the truth from both of us. I was nervous driving her to the cafe that morning. My hands were shaking as we pulled into the lot. Mark was already there, seated and waiting for us. I walked over to him with my aunt right behind me. She glanced at him, her eyes narrowing slightly in curiosity. I told her we needed to talk about something serious, and I could immediately see concern flash across her face. Once we ordered, I got right to the point. I told her that the man sitting across from her, Mark, was Linda's ex-husband. Mark gave her a polite smile, and Hilda looked at him, stunned. I asked her if she'd ever seen photos of Linda's late husband, and she shook her head. That's when I explained how I had stumbled across one of Linda's old photo albums years ago, and I'd seen pictures of Mark in it. Even though she didn't recognize him, my aunt knew enough to be shocked Mark was supposed to be dead. Mark then pulled out his phone and showed her photos of him and Linda together, pictures from their wedding, their honeymoon, and other moments that proved their history. And then he shared his story again, just like he had with me. How Linda pulled him into a marriage built on half-truths and emotional manipulation, how everything fell apart when she realized he wasn't leaving her any of his assets or insurance money, and how their divorce turned bitter. Mark told her how Linda accused him of financial abuse just to destroy his reputation, and how he eventually agreed to a huge alimony payout just to make it stop. He said that after that, she disappeared from his life until now. My aunt sat in silence for a moment, stunned. I filled in more details, how Linda deliberately seeks out wealthy, grieving people, how she uses fake sob stories to earn sympathy, and how she marries them hoping to gain access to their money or property. You could see the shift in my aunt's face, the shock, then the worry, and finally, full-blown anger. She turned to me and said we had to tell my father. Sooner rather than later. She was afraid Linda might try to pull the same stunt with him that she had with Mark. Mark agreed. He warned us that Linda was more than capable of doing whatever it took when it came to money. I nodded, finally feeling like I wasn't carrying this burden alone. With my aunt now in the loop, and with Mark's photos and testimony, we had something real proof. Before we left, Mark and my aunt exchanged numbers so he could send her all the pictures. We walked out of that cafe with a shared sense of purpose. None of us said it out loud, but we all knew we were going to expose Linda for who she really was and protect my father. Since coming home, my aunt and I have been trying to figure out how and when to have this talk with my dad. We both agreed on one thing: whatever we do, we can't have this conversation with Linda present. We no longer trust her at all, and we need to make sure she can't manipulate the situation when we reveal what we've learned. Update 2. We finally told my dad the truth this past Thanksgiving. I knew I had to be there in person. There was no way I was having this conversation over the phone. So I arranged some time off, packed my bags, and flew home for our annual family celebration. When I got there, the house was already decorated for the holidays, full of warmth and lights. Linda greeted me at the door with her usual smile. It was the first time I'd seen her since finding out about her past. I managed a polite, awkward smile before hurrying off to find my dad. It had been too long since I'd seen him, and I missed him more than I realized. Thanksgiving dinner went smoothly. We laughed, ate too much, and enjoyed the evening as a family. My aunt and I kept exchanging looks across the table, both of us waiting for the right moment. But it didn't come that night. The next day, I told my dad I wanted to take him out for lunch, under the pretense of talking about work projects. I knew Linda had zero interest in anything business-related, so I was sure she'd sit this one out. Dad seemed surprised when Hilda showed up too. He thought it was just going to be the two of us. Once we sat down, Hilda got straight to the point. She asked if he had ever looked into Linda's past. He looked confused and said no, he'd never seen a reason to. That's when I pulled out the photos of Linda and Mark together and asked him if he recognized the man. He nodded, a little uncertain, and said, "That's Mark, Linda's ex-husband. The one who passed away." I looked him in the eyes and told him that Mark is alive. I had met him through work. And the truth is, he never died in a fire. Linda had made that up. I told him everything: how Linda had divorced Mark after he refused to sign over his assets, how she tried to ruin his reputation with lies, and how she vanished after securing a large alimony payment from him. My dad leaned back in his chair, trying to process everything I just told him. There was this long stretch of silence, and then he looked at me and asked, "How did you find out about all of this? And why would Linda lie to me?" I took a deep breath and told him everything, starting with how I met Mark at work. It was pure coincidence that brought him into my office as a potential client, but that strange feeling of familiarity had sparked a chain of events I never saw coming. I explained how I eventually realized who he was, how I confronted him, and how shocked he was to learn Linda had told people he was dead, specifically, that he died in a fire. As I talked, my dad's expression slowly shifted. The initial surprise on his face turned into something deeper: shock, disbelief, and a kind of painful realization. You could tell he was torn. On one side was the version of reality he'd been living in for years, and on the other was the truth that I had just placed in front of him. He started asking more questions about Mark, about what exactly happened between him and Linda. He wanted to understand how deep the deception ran. Aunt Hilda stepped in at that point. She explained how Linda met Mark in a grief support group, claiming her previous husband had died in a shooting. How she got close to him, married him, and then turned everything sour the moment he wouldn't hand over his house or life insurance. Hilda didn't sugarcoat it. She told Dad he had to recognize this for what it was: manipulation, plain and simple. A pattern. A scheme. And it was time he thought carefully about what came next. I could see the betrayal written all over my father's face. He looked lost, like the ground had just been pulled out from under him. And in that moment, I felt awful for being the one to break his heart. But I also knew it had to be done. He admitted he felt blindsided, torn between what Linda had always told him and what we were now revealing. As a last resort, we decided to FaceTime Mark. We thought maybe hearing it directly from him would help clear up any lingering doubts. At first, my dad was hesitant, but eventually he agreed. The conversation between the two of them lasted a while. Mark was calm but honest, walking my dad through everything: how he met Linda, what their marriage was like, how it ended, and how she vanished from his life. You could almost see the truth sinking in as they talked. My dad grew quiet. His face went pale. He looked like someone who had just watched his whole reality crumble in front of him. My aunt tried her best to comfort him, understanding just how hard it was for him to process it all. I told my dad there was no pressure to figure everything out that very moment. I just wanted him to know that Hilda and I were both here for him, no matter what he decided to do next. His well-being was what mattered now. The truth about Linda hit hard, for all of us, but especially for him. And while none of us knew exactly what the next steps would look like, we agreed on one thing: we had to support each other and protect what was left of our family. Update 3. It's been about 2 months since we told my dad the truth, and a lot has happened since then. Shortly after that conversation, my dad confronted Linda. It led to an explosive argument. She tried to deny it at first, but once he presented the photos of her and Mark together and told her that Mark had spoken to me and confirmed everything, she couldn't lie her way out anymore. Cornered, she finally admitted it. She confessed to the lies, to faking Mark's death, to everything. She looked overwhelmed, maybe even ashamed, but it was too little, too late. My dad, who almost never raises his voice, told her to leave the house immediately. It was the first time I'd ever seen him truly angry. Linda, clearly shaken, glared at me as she gathered her things, like I was the one to blame for exposing her. But I didn't flinch. I didn't feel bad. She had no place in our lives anymore. Not long after that, my dad filed for divorce and got in touch with an attorney. I could tell the whole thing wore him down. He was devastated. But thankfully, our family is close-knit, and everyone rallied around him. They were just as shocked by Linda's lies as we had been, and they made sure my dad knew he wasn't alone. Linda tried to reach out to him a few times afterward, but he blocked her on every platform. As for me, she hasn't even tried. I think she knows I'd never give her the time of day after everything she's done. These days, my dad is still working through it all. There are good days and bad ones. But I can honestly say I'm proud of him for walking away from her. She was toxic, and now that she's out of our lives, there's room to heal. If anything good came from this, it's that my dad and I are closer than ever. We talk more. We share how we're feeling instead of brushing things under the rug. We've been navigating the emotional mess together, and even though there's still pain, there's also progress. It'll take time to move past all of this, but I know we will. Little by little, we're stepping out from under the shadow Linda cast on our lives. We're finally getting back to who we were before she came into the picture, stronger, wiser, and looking forward to better days ahead.